Okay, everyone, let's get started now, and welcome to the Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities Public Life Conversation Series. I'm very, very happy, honored, and immensely pleased to welcome my friend Homi Bhabha, who, as many of you know, is one of the leading figures in post-colonial theory, thought, and writing. In addition to being the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities in the English Department and Comparative Literature Department at Harvard University, he also served as the director of the Humanities Center there, and he's the founding director of the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard, and served in the inaugural position of the senior advisor to the president and provost of Harvard University. In addition to the work on post-colonial theory, he of course has written a great deal on literature in general, cultural change and power, contemporary art, and cosmopolitanism, as well as migration, and we're going to talk about that a fair bit. He's no stranger to Southern England or to England at all. In fact, just earlier in his career, he was just down the road at Sussex, where he wrote The Location of Culture, and he also wrote and edited Nation and Narration, which are seminal works in the field of post-colonial studies. In terms of contemporary art, he writes for Artforum, and he has essays on William Kentridge, Anish Kapoor, Matthew Barney, and I think you've also done some work on our friend Kitchish Jalit as well. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Homi and say thank you for joining us today, Homi.
Thank you, Ron. Delighted to be in Southampton, although I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Well, having in the telepresence is good enough for now, but we'll just have to get you here in person, shall we?
Love that.
Okay,
I'd love that.
That sounds great. Let's. I sent you. I mean, we talked about a number of different topics, and so I'd kind of like to talk initially about migration ethics and politics and language, perhaps linking it to aesthetics. One place we could start would be with the continual and persistent concern throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries with migration and refugees. How that can be also understood as the right to move and to create horizons of hope in the midst of chaotic, polarized, and hermetically sealed public discursive domains and discursive debates. And you kind of put it in a really interesting way in a piece that you wrote about migration, in which you said, can one person's fog of ahistorical international social ethnic warfare and revanchist nostalgic nationalism also be another's lightning strike of grievance as clarity, so that the impetus, the catalyst to move, is also sometimes a catalyst for the understanding of the right of that movement?
Ron, I'm reminded of a statement by Toni Morrison. Sorry, by Toni Morrison, absolutely, where she talks about the importance of movement in a show that she curated at the Louvre. The fundamental importance of movement, but that is underlined by Hannah Arendt's idea that you cannot think about the concept, the thought of freedom, without thinking about movement. And I think the right to movement is a fundamental human right. Of course, the right to movement has generated a number of legal and political frameworks. How you can move, why you have to cross an international boundary to be recognized as a refugee, according to the 51 Refugee Convention. So there is a whole legal apparatus and behind it, and I think that is enabling at times and constraining at times. The border wars we have in Many countries, including the southern border of the United States,
Yes.
Are examples where those rights are continually being thwarted, not simply on a legal basis, but on a procedural basis, that you make the processing of those things take so long and are so laborious. You make demands that people cannot satisfy in their critical conditions, which is as good as thwarting the law, while doing so simply by invoking procedural practice. So I think that this is a very complex political, social, geopolitical aspect of this question of migration. But the ethics of movement and migration interest me a great deal. Mm-hmm. And but what do I mean by the ethics of movement? Let me sort of just break this down as quickly as I can.
Okay.
First of all, the question of hospitality. What does hospitality entail in our time? There is, to elaborate on that, hospitality, of course, Derrida talked about unconditional hospitality. That is fine and dandy, but I think it is, in some ways, it doesn't speak to the point. I think it's a fine idea, but the conditions of hospitality are important. Not only, as I say, because there have to be certain conditionalities in place for exiting, but there are certain conditionalities in place for providing hospitality in the process of welcoming migrants. And I think here states play a large point, a large place. And so I think that unconditional hospitality is not very helpful in thinking about the realpolitik or the ethics of migration. Now, the ethics of migration, I have to do also with two other issues that I want to raise today.
Okay.
One is the question of the present moment, mm-hmm. the conditions, as I said, and conditionalities of present-day hospitality at the point of the entry and at the point of the emergence of a group of migrants. But it is also a question about futurity. When I was doing some work on this issue, there was a Red Cross worker in Tunisia who was in the presence of certain dead migrants and their bodies, their physical presence. And he said, we have to continue this fight for the rights of movement and the human rights of migrants because these people deserve rights. These dead people deserve their rights. Now, he was not talking about respectful burial and so on, which he was talking about the fact that this group experience the question of death from the very moment in which they decide to move. That's the way I interpreted it. That the physical death, the question of mortality, has to also be seen as a problem of death in the politics of migration, and people who are, in the face of death, hoping to resettle, to move, to have restored to themselves the rights of residents, citizens, and the right to life and the right to a good life. So it seems to me that the discourse of migration has to start with the ethics of the death of the neighbor. And here, of course, we can invoke Levinas, should we want to do it. But we have to start thinking about death in life in a very profound way. That includes, as Foucault once said, all the implications of social life. So death is not simply to die of disease or to die of neglect. There's a certain form of death in not being able to be employed. There's a certain form of death in discrimination. I believe that humiliating others, and particularly on the basis of their race or their religion, yes, humiliation is a kind of death, a kind of living dying. Humiliation is almost like saying, you do not belong amongst humankind.
Yeah, you do not count. I think that issue of futurity is really interesting, and the imperative of thought is really the imperative of a hope for a future moment, in which that thought will count beyond the evanescent now in which it occurs. And I think if we begin to place that into a domain of multiple kinds of mortalities and multiple deaths, as you were just doing, then the refugee status reveals the absolute ethical position of our relationship to others.
That's absolutely right. And let me just elaborate on that.
Okay.
In two ways. One, if you think of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights,
yes,
the significant term of life, if I might put it that way, is birth.
Mm-hmm.
It starts with this idea that we are all born with dignity.
Yes.
The dignity is, in a way, the qualitative characterizing feature of our humanity and why we are born with the right to have rights.
Yes.
Yeah. So it starts with birth. Now I'm suggesting, supposing we start with the question of impending death,
yes,
which is so central to the movement of migration, the movement of refugees. A Tunisian refugee once said, this Mediterranean crossing may cost me my life.
Mm-hmm.
But even if I have a 1% chance of living, I want to live it in the embrace of rights and representations. So I think my interest in this work is to say, supposing we started with the question of death in the broadest philosophical sense, as I've been saying, in the broadest in the broadest metaphysical, but also metaphorical sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think Levinas calls it the death metaphor, or if we start, or something of that.
Death in life metaphor, or something like that.
Death life metaphor, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important. So that at the philosophical, ethical level. At the other level, I feel that there's a question of political ethics. If you see the question of citizenship in the Russian doll metaphor, where you take one doll and there's another one and there's another one, at the heart of that citizenship is, in my belief, is not the good life of the citizen, but the good death of the citizen. Everything that citizenship gives you is to protect you and give you a good death. A good death also means that the life conditions that precede your death are good ones. That the support of your family, the support of the state, the support of the community is giving you a good death. Good deaths, I suggest, are a moral measure of the good life.
That's a really nice idea, and in that way, that kind of the good life being dependent upon the good life of others and the good death of others, that your good death is intimately bound with the good death of others, and cannot exist without that condition. It's exactly where the role of the arts and the humanities can begin to have a different, or has always had an important voice in these concerns, even though it is discursively marginalized in the larger geopolitical sphere. But the poetics of theory and narration in relation to the imperatives of the refugee condition and the opportunity for hospitality seems to me one of the things that we can bring to the table as part of a contribution to the public domain.
I think that's right. That's why there has been such a rich flow of artworks, even architectural projects.
Absolutely.
To do with photography, video, cinema, painting. I mean, this has become a major inspiration. And if you can tie it back to Bruegel's Death of Icarus painting,
yes,
which has always been a major inspiration for me.
Because
a major inspiration. I've never written about it to my satisfaction, but I have written about it in unsatisfactory ways many times. Unsatisfactory for me. But if you think of that painting, and had I known that we would arrive here, we might have had it on the screen, but we don't need to have it. Icarus is only visible as a minute detail with these two little legs flailing in the water. But as Auden, then there is
Auden
this
is
great
great
ship,
on that,
which, as Auden says, has to move on. It's something, this great trading vessel, this vessel that represents a different kind of movement to the one of the drowning of Icarus. And of course, Icarus and his father were migrants trying to get home.
Yes.
Having been held in and having been forced to build the maze, they wanted to go back home. So it's a migration story. And so here is the ship going by because it has somewhere to get to and had to get there. The plowman plowing his field, thinking in the Christian way, and I know there's a Christian proverb behind it, that you have to plow, whatever else happens, you've got to plow your way through the day. And then there are many other details that I won't get into, but this is about the whole question of the optimism of migration. And that is something that many of the most advanced and interesting scholars of refugees say, the thing that the EU doesn't understand, the thing that most people don't understand, is that there is this death-life coupling. People want to migrate and will continue to do it because there's a certain kind of optimism of mortality. They know that they have got to get there, even if their chances are small. So they do it because of this optimism for life and because of this optimism for a life of dignity and productivity. And I think that's important. But so that's in a way the Icarus figure. You can describe it in many other ways. But then there is on the plowman who says, I've just got to get on with my own life,
That's
and
right.
I get on. And here is the moral issue. You have to get on with your own life. You've got to plow on the one hand. On the other hand, there is a child plowing in the water.
Yes.
How do you find the right balance?
Yeah. I'm also interested about Achille Mbembe's work on this in terms of Black bodies as corporeal, mobile borders, that the Black body in and of itself becomes a kind of site of borderization. And as we're engaged in this increased borderizing of the world, that the Black body is something that isn't as allowed to circulate in the same way that others can and do.
Of course, that's absolutely right, and that's what why we started talking about the right to move, the right to movement. And by the way, when I say the right to movement, I also mean the right to mobilize movements against the abrogation of the right to movement. So I'm using movement both as a political body, as a political form of protest, as much as I'm talking about it as a legal and ethical issue. And I just want to bring those two, they're connected. The right to movement and the right to build movements are connected. Very often, those who strike down the right to build movements are those who are also striking down the right to movement. So I think Ashil's point is well taken. I want to say, however, I also want to say that if believing as I do in death life, I don't always see the black body as a corporeal body.
Right.
I see the forces that want it to be that kind of biopolitical body that carries the border like a split. But there are different ways in which the border is carried in the body, and I think we need to recognize that. And if we recognize that, then we also have to recognize the great wealth of the poetry, the dance, the writings of black bodies. I'm using those arts which most involve kind of movement, poetry, dance, lyric, cinema. So I think that there is a kind of poetics that the body carries, which doesn't overwhelm the border, but has to be spoken and has to be acknowledged. Otherwise, these bodies simply become figurations of bare life, and I have certain concerns about that way, because I think if they're seen largely in that way, then there is something about their agency against all the odds that is not being heard and it's not being represented. So, for instance, there cannot be a more viscerally violent image than the famous moment in Black Skin, White Masks, when the black figure, aka Fanon, says, "Here I am, my body is being cut limb by limb, I'm being burdened by stereotypes, I'm being burdened by prejudices, I'm being burdened by historical antecedents that don't actually belong to me. I am being split in 3 ways or in many parts." But then there is also this idea, but out of this, I have to rebuild myself. I am patient, I watch, and I decide to ask my questions from within. So I think we have to be able to attribute that kind of dark agency, what Baldwin called the negative way, to this moment of the black body. This is why I'm not sympathetic to issues around the bare life.
I'm in agreement with that, because I think it can and does often lead to an intensification of objection. And
it does. Yeah. And it also leads to a kind of ongoing pessimism where, as I was saying, in rewriting, say, the Universal Declaration with death, not birth, which is not entirely about pessimism, it is entirely about acknowledging something, but it actually leads to a kind of pessimism, which I think a lot of black bodies are dealing with, but are being incredibly creative with also. And that's why I think that's important. And in this respect, I think, having accepted many of the darker political versions of this condition, I actually believe that the condition of a lot of migrants and refugees is what Adorno also called, and Bloch called, disappointed hope.
Yes. Bloch is particularly good on that, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
I can't say that I've plowed through all 3 volumes because I find them unreadable quite often. Or let's just say I'm not educated enough to be able to get the juice of them. But I feel very much that the concept that hope is always suspended. So it's not a kind of it's not simply utopia and then dystopia. I think there is a kind of middle life and an interstitial moment to which I've always given importance, both as identification and as agency.
And again, as hope, yeah.
And as hope, yeah. Disappointed hope, you know.
Yes, disappointed hope, yes. But I mean, that's the thing about Block, I think, is particularly good on different modes of different temporalities existing at the same time. The simultaneity of the non-simultaneous. I like that quite a lot, actually.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was thinking too of your friend Salman Rushdie, and in the 90s he wrote something that I used to use quite a lot that I liked, where he talked about the conditions of the epoch that we would call modernity were alienation and rootlessness, and in contrast, in postmodernity, and he was referring to his own condition and situation, there was too much rootedness, being rooted in too many places and cultures at the same time. Do you think we've returned into a condition that is perhaps more indicative of modernity, a repetition, but a kind of like a surenchère, a repetition, but with an intensification of the stakes, where there is a lot of rootedness? Or do you think we're still in a hopeful condition of being rooted in many places and being able to move, with a kind of negative capability between different alliances, different spaces, and different understandings of what it means to be?
Well, let me start by saying that I think ethno-nationalist majoritarianism is more or less now a global phenomenon in different ways and different moves. When people say, what is globalization about? Is it about the free flow of capital? Yes, maybe. Is it about the free flow of people? No. Is it about labor, the movement of labor? No. But one of the things we've got to understand in the light of your question, I believe, is that there is a huge attempt to create a new kind of a new kind of rootedness, and the roots of that rootedness are as much a sense of geography. The nation state is your stone of patriotism. This is where the church. This is the rock on which the church of patriotism. So you have to be committed to that. And this is, of course, a majoritarian patriotism. And so there is, on the one hand, this call for a certain kind of rootedness, the autocratic call for rootedness. And it is rooted not so much in political discourse as it is rooted in a certain kind of theological political discourse, whether it's
theocracy,
whether it's Islam, whether it's Hinduism, whether it's Christian evangelism in the United States. So I think there is a sense that we've got to now expand our rational, liberal, progressive discourse to attend to questions of affect, because I think what ethno-nationalists have seen, ethno-nationalist populists, is exactly how important rhetoric and affect is. And we deconstruct sentences, but we don't often think, and that's a very useful thing. Let me not, I think that's enormously useful. But I think we ought to now begin to see these hybrid forms of discourse and their power, and where we need to reintroduce a kind of affectivity into our political discourse. So I think that, so that on the one hand, I think there is a force against free movement, as we've been talking about, or just movement. Instead of just free movement, I prefer the term equitable movement.
Equitable movement, yeah.
Equitable movement is the way I would put it. On the other hand, let's also be clear that postmodern, the free will of postmodern movement is a discourse of privilege.
Absolutely.
And so, it's a discourse of privilege. I think what Salman is talking about more maybe than physical movement or the movement across places is also a kind of conceptual aesthetic movement, the possibility that you can affiliate despite your own conditions of life to other conditions of life, to other cultures, that you can actually speak with them, if not for them. And I think that's something that is increasing. It's increasing in the range of remarkable works now that are written about the border and about movements across borders or about the refugee condition. So I think that this is not a kind of jeune postmodernist sense of, I can be in many places at the same time and I can affiliate with whomsoever I like, so long as the theoretical conditions are clear. It's not that. It's something more strategic and it's something more constraining, but I think productive at the same time.
Yeah, I forgot I have a little bit of housekeeping I meant to say. That is, we will be moving to Q&A in about 15 minutes or less.
Whenever.
Yes, but I just need to tell the people who are attending that they will be providing the cues that you'll be offering A's for, that they can put them in the chat and that we will be turning to them in just a bit. A point that you just made kind of reminded me of something that you were writing about in The Fragility of Democracy, that nice little piece you have there, The Fragility of Democracy Now, Everywhere and Anywhere, where you talk about the lyric form as a really interesting aesthetics or poetics for dealing with the temporality of an event, that short measures of traumatic time that the lyric can work with and demonstrate has an intense, as you say, an encrypted existence, whereas institutional incidents of systemic racism, for example, are recorded in linear or evolutionary narratives, or the progress of policy and the failure of political will, or vice versa. And I think moving towards a way of thinking, as you do, and you do very well, the power of the rhetorical and aesthetic articulation of these positions, but including temporality as well as spatiality. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, Ran, I will talk just a little bit because this is a large and complex question.
It is.
Which I'm involved in trying to think about, in a way, the importance of systemic racism and its long history and the effective political impact of short forms of time, like the 8.49 or 9 minutes of George Floyd's death, and
Right.
how the video recording of that, and the event itself, which was a short trauma. Freud often says trauma is short, but its implications, its dissemination, its symptomatization is actually long. And so it seems to me that many of our current political movements, whether it was the Arab Springs, where a fruit seller, set himself on fire, these things, or George Floyd, or several others, these things are short moments of time, and they're not, but they're often read as being systemic. Whereas I think they're doing something more in inspiring people to move, to protest, to reconstitute themselves as Black Lives Matter or Wall Street. So I think the small moment is what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the history of the moment and its implications. I feel, however, that this is an important issue to explore, and it becomes an important issue in relation to new technologies that we have that communicate messages. I also feel that the iPhone, where you can see these short moments of time, you see them now in relation to Israel, the moment every Saturday that people protest. You see them in relation to what's happening on the streets in Iran. They are, in fact, edited into short moments and given to you. And when you hold them in your hand, there is a kind of haptic identification. You are actually touching what is happening. It's part of the prosthetic of your body. And then you look at it, and you don't look at it only informationally. You look at it with a sense of identification, affective as well as ethical. So that's, you know, the embodiedness of the technology. That's a different kind of biopolitics than our friend Michel Foucault assumed. So it seems to me that the lyric has that great gift of turning on a moment. It is compressed. It is rather like what Benjamin described as a constellation. It breaks from large, continuous evolutionary notions of time. It presents us, I forget the exact word that Benjamin uses because I use it so much. It presents us with a short, what is a reflective element, like a faceted stone that reflects many different aspects. And in the detail, in a way, you see something of the architecture of the whole problem, the whole event. And so I think the lyric does that. Of course, the work that set me off in one way, in the poetic sense, was Claudia Rankine's Citizen when I first read it, where the entire work, as you know, is, and as Claudia alerted me to, it's in 7 parts. It's like 7 days, 7 different moments of the kind that I'm talking about. 7 different prismatic moments. And then in each moment, language is continually both representing some form of racial encounter, but then also questioning its interpretation. And I think lyrics do that. They present something, but the shortness of the lyric not only catches the moment, but it also catches you thinking and interpreting the moment.
Yeah, I like that very much because it is that kind of that flash of recognition.
Yes.
Right. There's a bit in Philip Roth where he talks about a neo-Nazi movement marching towards the house of this middle-class Jewish family, and he said, you know, you can prepare yourself for the violence, and you can prepare yourself for the house exploding. I'm paraphrasing here. He said, you can be prepared for that, but nothing prepares you for the sight of the clothes in the trees. And I think it's that moment of just that the house will explode. Whose house is this? You know, and do you want to go to a house that's on fire? But when it explodes, that aftermath, the fall,
So my dear Ryan, I absolutely take your point. Reminds me of another lyric, Toni Morrison. In Toni Morrison's great lyric, "Whose house is this?"
Yes,
which is the prefatory lyric to her later novel, Home. She, in fact, invited me to go with her to Lincoln Center. With a group of us went with her as her invitees when the lyric was first put to music by André Previn, and Kathleen Battle performed it. And I was completely taken with that lyric because it pulls together many of the things we've been talking about: movement, migration, the fact that the body, the borderline body, is also the body of creativity, your third point. The fourth point about hospitality and about returning and you know, being settled, and of course of the whole history of the negative way, because the lyric says, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, whose house is this? It is not mine. Mine was much more beautiful, da 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 da. And then it says, this is not my home, but why? This is not my house, but why does my key fit the lock?
Oh yeah, very nice.
Why does my key fit the lock? So like many of our current political movements, short movements which have had much shorter lives than great political parties, what inspires me about them is that they both accept the deep disappointments of the democratic promise. And on the other hand, they say there is no running away from it.
Yes.
This is not just something that happened to us. We are also part of the problem. Our key fits this lock. We enter the what Baldwin famously called, "Do you really want to enter the burning house?"
House, yes.
And his answer is yes.
Yes,
you have to enter it because you cannot resolve this problem elsewhere.
Yeah.
So this is a corrective in my work, the use of death, dying, social death, as the basis of a kind of activism and disappointed hope. And this is why I want to turn the notion of life on its, to invert it. And in conversations with Claudia, I've been working on this idea that the statistical view is always about the figures of death, right? The risk of death is where inequity steps in. But my interest is as much about the risk of living. The fact that George Floyd had to take a grubby note, 20 pounds, maybe counterfeit, to buy cigarettes.
Yes.
And then get into the car. That risk of life, and then he dies, half an hour later.
Yes.
Or somebody's walking through their grandmother's garden and they seem to be an intruder because of their color and they're shot. All the moments leading up to the murder is the kind of traumatic moment that I'm as interested in for political, aesthetic, ethical reasons as the larger figures and datas of death.
Yeah, that was a really lovely, evocative, and skilled summation of a lot of what we've been discussing. That might be then a really good cue to leap over to the cues that are queuing up to ask you. Let me delve into it. I think Anushka was going to do some culling for me, but I'm not sure if she has. Let me see what we have here. Oh, my good friend and colleague Kwame Phillips is talking about, he says, it's maybe not just the accessibility of the moments, but the manner in which we choose or can engage with them. No matter how common they are, we can opt out of engagement by scrolling past, not allowing sensitive material to be seen in our apps. I mean, I think that's true. A lot of these things can be pulled in for us, but part of what we can do when we are looking, we may be haptically connected, but we can also say just as easily, thank God I'm not there.
Yes, of course you can do that, but you can always do that. You can do that with passing moments, or you can do that with large events. I know people here who turn the front page not to be able to see the new assault by the Trumpians on democracy.
Yeah.
Now, that is an attentiveness, and that's both a moral attentiveness as well as a attentiveness to reading the moment, which you can always have. But I'm saying that there is much less attention to the moments that I'm talking about, which are profoundly politically and humanely important, than there is to just cast your eye on a whole list of data and say, God, isn't it terrible that there is such inequality in racial inequality in America? I'm saying that data is important, but I'm saying the day-to-day is as important. And of course, I'm calling for a cultivation of a different kind of politics and poetics of time. That's what I'm calling for. Your colleague, he's right. I'm calling for not being able to somehow as easily pass on to the headlines.
I agree. And that moment, the sharpness of that moment that we've been talking about is not the sharpness necessarily of the metonym. It's
No,
something.
it's not the sharpness of it's the sharpness of the constellation, is
Yes. Yes.
Benjamin would say. In that moment, a lot of contradictions happen. In that moment of George Floyd, there is the whole reason for the reason why unemployed black people and amongst others resort to drugs. So there's a whole question of the drug economy. There's a question of health and epidemiology. People wanted to argue that basically George Floyd died because there were drugs in his body, but that he may have had a heart issue, etc. So there's the fact, the neglect, the lack of access for people of color and minorities in general to the health system. Then there is police violence, and it's not just police violence. It's a particular notion of qualified immunity, this particular vicious and heinous legal instrument, which they're now trying to get rid of, where judges would say, up to the Supreme Court, these things, these moments happen so fast. We have to take the policeman's perspective, because the policeman here, the officer, has been trained to deal with these moments. Again, the question of time. Qualified immunity, which has let so many criminal justice offenders, police go, is in fact a whole matter of time. Read the law on it. Read the examples of it in the use of judgment. So what I'm saying is, and I won't go on, these are hugely constellated moments. And if I could only find that word that Benjamin uses, but I should not be complaining, but it's like a crystal. That's the word he used, a crystal which keeps showing you, reflecting so many different aspects. And this work that I'm doing on the moment and the political temporality of the moment is connected, as you have seen in my piece on democracy, to the notion of the unprepared. Why are we always unprepared for things we know that are going to happen? This is not simply an individual existential question. This is because regimes of power, forms of education, always make us feel that we are prepared, and then somehow surveillance and governance, this is something we ought to talk about. The moment in contemporary ethno-nationalist politics. Indian people through the nation were given 4 hours to de-densify cities. 4 hours. Mr. Modi made the announcement at 8, and he said that after midnight, anybody who was caught out on the streets would be apprehended. 4 hours. Please remember that this kind of being made to be an unprepared citizen, quite apart from our own phenomenological and philosophical unpreparedness, is part of the new regime.
I think that's a really interesting point that you're making there, because unpreparedness is the nature of the situation anyway. As you
That's
say,
right. But I'm against
this.
I'm sorry for interrupting, but I'm against this notion of contingency or precarity as being the kind of ontology of the present.
Oh, right.
Yeah. When was certainty the ontology of the present?
It's never been.
So I don't like those kinds of, that's why I'm also interested in moments, in the moment, because I don't like those sort of generalizations,
Well, I think sometimes people rely on that precarity because it is, I mean, it's like death. It's the thing that we repress. It is the thing that we want to have kept away. That the good life is no awareness of a good death at all, or any kind of death at all.
Yes, and I think that very often, when we say we don't know death, what do we know about my mother just died? I was at the bedside beside her, and what was very clear to me was that what she was actually so frightened of, until the moment came and she was not even aware of it, was the whole process of dying.
Yes, the art of dying.
Yes. Well, art is, yes, there is an art of dying, but there is also a diminution of dying.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
anyway, I just
And the
wanted
foreign
to.
land, which is ours.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's, yeah. I need to, I mean, I keep veering us off because I'm greedy. Um, do, I had a question from Graham Harwood, a really terrific artist, and he asks, can the death of migrants in the seas around Europe be seen as a sort of acceptable sacrifice to uphold the notion of civilized Europe? That we allow people to die because, I mean, talk about preparedness, allow people to die in on a grand scale, but in waves.
Yeah,
In
I get the question, and I think this is a very painful issue to face. I think that I wouldn't want to personally think of it in that larger sort of civilizational framework,
no, yeah,
but the implications of it, that you let there are populations whose life is not considered as valuable as others. That doesn't only happen in migration, that happens
happens
in
everywhere.
everyday democratic national life. So I think there is something about that. But of course, with migration, despite the laws of refugees, et cetera, and human rights, people say the way to deal with that is to say, of course, these people died. It's so terrible because it was a crisis. Sorry, this use of emergency and crisis is actually very convenient,
Yeah,
and is
and it becomes a
actually often
convenient
quite
legal position.
venal, because
What's that?
these are not things that happen overnight.
No, an
Look at the
emergency
migration
becomes,
deaths now that are off the front pages.
yeah,
Now you find them on the columns, below the, if there's a large number of people die, you find it, below the fold or elsewhere. But
yeah,
nobody's talking about the migration crisis that they did a few years ago. That doesn't mean the crisis doesn't exist. So I'm just saying that this large mythological argument, I wouldn't go with. I mean, I understand it. I wouldn't make it. It's perfectly legitimate to do so. But I think there are reasons why that harsh reality would occur to one.
yeah. I like the point you were making too about the emergency, because the emergency gives us a kind of out, but it also
Absolutely.
gets mobilized as a legal political position to
Correct.
suspend all kinds of rights, as we saw post 9/11, for example.
Absolutely. Let's
Yeah.
get on to some other questions, Aaron, if there are
Okay,
any.
very quickly, because we're almost out of time. One quick one that says, well, not that quick. Could you elaborate on the meaning that Morrison's quote has for you regarding the novel Home and the history of systemic racism? All in 3 minutes or less.
Well, I can't. Well, what it has for me, what it has for me,
Yes.
as somebody who has moved my home, is been apparent in what I've said, that my key, India, which is the where I came and where I return to several times a year, is still very much is very homey to me in a way that no other place is. When I enter my home in Bombay, I feel homey. I don't know what that means, but that's what I feel. And yet, I am, in whatever small way, and it's very small, doing what I can from a distance, and also when I'm there, to say, this is not the home I knew. I learned the first elements of what cosmopolitanism was, what vernacular cosmopolitanism was, what hybridization of societies, what migrants living together was like, was from Bombay. And, that's not there anymore. And I do whatever I can to understand it, or to make a case for it. As far as being in Cambridge goes, or in London, these are also my homes, but there are problems. That's why I've been talking about India and the US more or less interchangeably in some ways, or certainly side by side. So they are part of the crystals of my living and my thinking. As far as systemic racism goes, I don't know what I'm supposed to say here. I've said that I'm trying to work on making a supplementary articulation of the two ideas, thinking that we move too much towards the politics of systemic racism and questions of policy, and movements that arise from the more traumatic racist moments, these short moments that have long histories, have been in a way less analyzed, and that's what I'm trying to do. I can't do better than that. I apologize.
The iterative racism. Well, I think with that, we can probably go ahead and draw a line under this, because I'm very much aware of your time, and I know you have to teach this afternoon, and I don't want to keep you too long, but it has been just a wonderful honor to speak with you, and I really enjoyed it, Homi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ran. I wish I were there, and I wish I was looking at all these kind people who've attended today, but maybe that will happen sometime. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and we hope to get you here in person next time.
Love it. Love it. Thanks a lot.
Take good care, Homi. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.